This is Arya, and you're listening to Rabid Courage, where we dive into the heart of the matter and walk with truth without a leash. I've lost people. I've lost people I've loved, and I've lost dreams that I thought would carry me somewhere specific. Maybe not all at once, maybe not dramatically, where those losses were necessarily obvious. Some were quiet, some had names. Others just left impressions. And I want to start here because most of us are taught the wrong picture of grief. We're taught that grief is cinematic, this fallout from a grand event, death, funerals, black clothes, formal mourning performed for all to see. You know, grief is something tragic that happens after a big moment. But that's not the grief most of us are living with day to day. Those big moments don't happen all the time. So most grief doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps. From all the situations where we had to shift how we oriented our sense of reality. This type of grief doesn't usually announce itself. It slips in sideways. You're okay on the surface. You're functioning. You're showing up. You're doing what's required, but something in you feels like it's always holding its breath, as if waiting for something. Like your inner weather has shifted and your tolerance feels thinner, like your patience is being rationed, and your body resists the momentum it used to cooperate with. And when you try to explain it, you reach for language that keeps things moving. Oh, it's stress, it's burnout, it's overwhelm. Things that are action-oriented, but very often, this is grief, not as an event. This episode is about grief as an undertow. I want to begin inside a state most people recognize but don't name. Grief that doesn't announce itself. It's not exactly sadness. It's that low background pressure that never quite lifts. The sense that something in you is waiting for news that has already arrived, but your mind hasn't quite yet agreed to receive it. And unlike what that clean before and after that we see in the movies, grief that's real moves differently. It doesn't show up with a soundtrack. It slides in when your guard is down. To me, grief is a condition of reorientation. And it begins not with the loss, but with a realization. And I think this is the part that most people miss. Grief is not something that happens when something ends for you. It happens when you realize that something isn't coming back in the form that you were still unconsciously expecting. And that realization can arrive long after the event itself, months, years. Sometimes grief begins when life finally slows down enough for your whole system to feel what it actually postponed. This is why people fall apart after stability returns. It's that decompensation moment after the crisis passes, after the divorce papers are signed, after the caregiving ends, after the adrenaline drains down and the body says, now. And this is not delayed weakness. It's deferred truth. I look at it as disorientation because most people think grief is about missing someone, missing a time, missing a place. But from the body's perspective, grief is about losing orientation. Something was a part of how you knew you were in the world and placed you somewhere in that context of your world. A person, a role, a pet, a future you were unconsciously leaning toward. A body that behaved predictably. Maybe that reference point then disappeared, and now your nervous system keeps reaching for coordinates that just no longer exist. And that can take time to understand what is happening, and that is why sometimes it feels so confusing before it feels sad. It's why people say, I don't know what's wrong, I just feel off. You're not off. Your internal map is outdated. Early attachment researchers noticed this long before social media language existed. Bowlby described grief as the protest of a system that expects reunion, not metaphorically, biologically. Your body keeps checking for something that used to answer back. I met a gentleman a few years ago, just in passing. We were at a bus station, and he was telling me about how he was standing on a train platform after work, and nothing dramatic had happened. Just one day he was watching trains come and go, like you do, when suddenly he mentioned his chest tightened hard enough to make him step back. And he said, "What's going on?" He went on to explain that he hadn't thought about his brother in months, not consciously. But his brother used to call him from that platform every Friday, complaining about work or joking about dinner. And he was at this platform on a Friday. And he mentioned how the call stopped years ago because his brother passed. He said, "My mind knew this, but it was like my body didn't quite get it yet." And in that moment, he described the tightening that he went through. And I realized he wasn't talking about memory. He was talking about an expectation collapsing. And that is what it is. Grief is what happens when an expectation finally dies and you know with every bone in your body, nothing's the same anymore. So let's talk about this from the body perspective. I feel that grief is not an emotion, not like sadness or happiness or surprise. It's a recalibration problem. Something that oriented and structured your sense of safety and timing or identity has now disappeared or changed irreversibly. Your nervous system keeps orienting toward it anyway out of habit. And this is why grief shows up as disorientation and irritability and exhaustion that sleep just doesn't solve. Sometimes it can be mental fog and difficulty planning, or sudden emotional flooding with no clear trigger. You're standing there and all of a sudden the feelings just well up, you start crying. And attachment research understood this early on. Bowlby was a British psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and psychologist, and he is best known as the founder of attachment theory. And he developed various theories to explain the intense, lasting emotional bonds that human beings form with one another, and he described grief as a system still signaling for reunion. Not in the abstract way, physiologically. Your body doesn't care about logic. It cares about pattern continuity. When continuity breaks, the system searches, and that search is painful. And when grief doesn't have language, it looks like pathology. Unnamed grief turns into symptoms. People get diagnosed with anxiety when they're actually living in unresolved loss. They think something's wrong with them because their body just won't move on. But grief that hasn't been metabolized doesn't sit politely in the background. It doesn't stay quiet. It leaks into relationships, into your work, your decision-making, into the way you interpret neutral events as threats. Colin Murray Parks, another pioneer in understanding bereavement, grief, and the psychological impact of loss, called this psychosocial transition. That period where your inner world hasn't caught up with reality. If no one names that transition, the tendency is to blame oneself. Grief that isn't witnessed keeps asking for attention through tension. Think about that. Grief that isn't witnessed keeps asking for attention through tension. I moved back into my own house after my last partner left. I came back that night, same furniture, same light, same familiar surroundings, and yet my body reacted like I'd entered hostile territory. I remember my shoulders scrunching up, my body tensing, and my sleep fractured. I couldn't get through the night without waking up constantly, and nothing was wrong, yet I kept checking the locks. The space itself was safe, but the meaning of the space had collapsed, and my system was trying to reorient. The house used to hold future, now it held evidence. My body wasn't anxious. It was grieving the death of a shared orientation. And this is where it gets tricky because at a social level, we have this myth of just getting through it. Our culture is very impatient with grief. We like arcs, resolution, and lessons. And grief resists all three: arcs, resolution, and lessons. Researchers like Niemeyer have shown that grief is not about closure. Rather, it's about meaning reconstruction. We all have functions of meaning making. We create narratives and story. So when something changes that used to orient us and is no longer there, the question is not, why did this happen? Rather, it's, who am I now that it did? And that question cannot be rushed. When we try, we get sentimentality instead of integration, because meaning emerges slowly through contact, not through insight. One of my favorite Buddhist teachers, Pema Chodron, talks about the practice of staying. Being present with yourself in the moment isn't about transcendence. It's about staying put when every instinct in you wants to flee. Grief activates that same reflex as threat. You tighten, you explain, you want to escape. But grief itself isn't solved by movement. I mean, think about this. It's digested through contact without amplification. What does that mean? Letting sensation exist without turning it into catastrophe, like you feel that pressure in your chest or that heat behind your eyes or that hollow feeling in your gut. In that moment, no commentary is required. This isn't softness or letting yourself get away with anything. This is discipline, letting yourself just be and just feel all of it. This is discipline. It's not easy to do. I, for many years, wrote an email every year on the same date that I never sent, and it was addressed to a former partner who had betrayed me. The betrayal didn't ruin my life, but it ruined my belief in being protected by integrity. I had this idea after the event happened, that idea was crushed, and that loss stayed active. And each year, writing that email provoked the same nausea, the same hand tremor, that same wave of heat. And I wasn't rehearsing confrontation. I was just acknowledging grief for broken trust. Grief doesn't want resolution. Sometimes it just needs to be witnessed. I love Frankl's work because Viktor Frankl never promised relief in anything he talked about, but he spoke about stance. And when suffering cannot be removed, meaning comes from how you stand inside of it. In grief, stance matters more than explanation. Do you turn against yourself? Do you harden into bitterness? Do you numb it? Or do you allow grief to alter you without it corroding your ethics? If you can do that, that's not heroism, it's maturity. You know, I love the Stoics, and boy, they sure were clear-eyed about loss. They didn't confuse acceptance with liking. They trained themselves to see clearly what was within their control and what was not. And grief, in my experience, intensifies when we keep negotiating with reality that has already changed. The if only, the what if, the I should have. Acceptance here isn't surrender, isn't giving up. It's the decision to stop spending energy on impossible reversals. That energy is needed elsewhere, in your system, in your life. One of the least discussed aspects of grief is when it turns inward and how it exposes part of us that we may perhaps rather not meet. We all have deep, untested beliefs. I call them emotional superstitions that we hold as implicit. They're dressed often in resentment, in relief. Sometimes it's anger at the dead, envy of the untouched. Jung explained beautifully how what isn't acknowledged doesn't just disappear. It becomes compulsive. If grief makes you less patient, less generous, less kind, that doesn't make you bad. It means something inside you is starving for recognition, starving for being witnessed. And then there's a kind of grief that doesn't have an ending, familial grief, where love doesn't end, but the shape does. It's not just death. Grief comes from so many things, like realizing a parent or a sibling or a child cannot meet you in the way you once needed or hoped for. Not because they're evil, because of limitation. Everyone has limits in their capacity. You may still see them, you may still talk, you still show up, but the role you wanted, whatever that was, ally, witness, soft place, protector, that's gone. You keep relating to the absence while you're pretending you're relating to the person. That's not denial, but that is adaptation under constraint. A very dear friend of mine calls her mother every week, and she offers something real, like a truth, a fear, an insight, and the response from the mother always comes back flattened. Advice too fast. She changes the subject. And after every call, she tells me her jaw aches and her body feels stiffer. And she said, yeah, but that's just how she is. And I thought, true, but that's also grief. For a mother who can't meet you where you need to be met as a daughter. Grief for the fantasy that someday she will. And that is how some bonds continue, and with them, their grief continues as well. One of the biggest shifts in modern grief theory is this. And I personally love this because it makes it so much more workable. Grief isn't something that needs to be resolved like a problem. It's something that needs to be witnessed, seen clearly, named accurately, held without argument, because a lot of grief stays lodged in the body because it was never allowed to count or be seen. People may say, oh, they did their best, or when there may have been some betrayal or some failing, or they may look back on a period of time that they were grieving and said it wasn't that bad, or they come out with moral statements like you should be grateful, at least you had XYZ. Now, those may all be true, but the truth without witness still hurts. The body settles when something is recognized. It's like, okay. Sometimes that witness is another person, and sometimes, most often, it has to be you. A former client of mine wrote a letter to his father after his death, and it wasn't about forgiveness, and it wasn't about reconciliation. He said it was about accuracy and naming what he loved, what he missed, what never happened, and what he stopped waiting for. And he didn't send it. He said he didn't want to ritualize it. Instead, what he did is he put it in a drawer, and he said when he finally closed the drawer, something in his body finally unclenched. And I told him that was witnessing. You were witnessing yourself in that process. And then there's the grief many of us know, which is the romantic attachment grief. When connection dies before love does. This grief hides especially well. Romantic grief is not necessarily where the relationship ended. Perhaps the relationship didn't even explode. It just thinned. The text kept coming and the logistics kept working, but the attunement faded. That sense of being chosen, being seen, being met, quietly disappeared. And you kept negotiating with yourself with, it's just a phase, or this is what long-term looks like. Or maybe you judged yourself like, I'm asking for too much, but your body knew. The way things tightened before bringing things up verbally, the way your energy dropped after intimacy that didn't quite land, the way it was like cables didn't connect when you were having that same conversation you might have had 100 times, and you felt lonelier with them than without. That is grief, not for the person necessarily, but for the connection you kept hoping would return. Towards the end of my last relationship, I noticed that I would pause before I shared anything real with my ex-partner. It wasn't fear. It was a moment of calculation. Is it worth it? Will it land? Will I feel smaller afterward if I say this, if I send this reel, if I send this comment? And that small pause is grief. It was my body adjusting to a lowered expectation. And when that grief wasn't witnessed, it hardened into resentment or at times self-erasure. So there's this dual process to grief. It comes and goes. There's this back and forth. And in modern understanding of grief, we understand there's this oscillation that you move towards the loss and then toward life. You feel it one day and then you function the next. You laugh, then you feel guilty. And that oscillation isn't failure and it's not a bug. It's literally a feature of the nervous system. It's regulation, the parasympathetic and sympathetic system working together. Grief overwhelms when we demand permanence, permanent pain, permanent healing. We don't work as permanent creatures. Except for this continuous sense of now, nothing in our experience can truly prove permanence. So our nervous system works in cycles: touch, withdraw, return. And that rhythm is health. So what do we do when grief surfaces midlife? And it's not because of crisis or it's not in collapse, but it just surfaces mid-sentence, mid-task, mid-responsibility. Here's the practice. First, I try to locate the loss, not philosophically, practically. What ended? What changed shape? What expectation is no longer viable? And then the second thing I do is I try to let my body register it. I drop my shoulders, I lengthen my exhale, I try to feel my feet, I feel out what's happening in my body. Sometimes I look around the room and just start naming things just to not fix anything, but just observe. And then the third thing that I do after locating the loss and letting my body register it is reduce demand. The reality is this: grief requires energy. Stop pretending you have the same bandwidth. This is not indulgence or feeling sorry for yourself or you being lazy. This is accurate accounting. And I'm being 100% sincere when I say that I don't think healing is ever returning to who you were. I don't think you can ever return to who you were. Here's the hard truth about recovery. It's especially painful because you have to become someone new who can live with what's true now. This is one of the hardest truths about healing that I've personally had to face. Grief isn't erased, nor is your identity that transitioned from a past state to the present. It's the reorientation of new meaning making that needs integration. And when it's given its due, it stops governing from below and integrates into the experience that you have above board. So here's the weekly challenge. This week, listen for the moment you say, I'm just tired, or I'm just off, or I'm just stressed. And maybe that's the case, but pause. Ask quietly, might I be grieving something here? And stop there. No solutions, no narratives, just observe. Just give yourself recognition. And that's how orientation begins to return. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Arya, and this is Rabid Courage. If this episode touched a nerve, like, subscribe, and share the love. I welcome your thoughts and stories about your truth without a leash. Come back next time. We'll step into intimacy and what happens when connection costs more than we expected. Until next time, stay human, stay honest, stay feral.